How lobsters went from prison food to elite food. We as humans eat a lot of things. In fact, we eat everything from the roots of plants hidden in the ground to some of the creatures present deep in the sea. But then, much like everything else in our world, our food items are divided into classes. The rich won't eat things the poor eat, and the poor obviously cannot afford the items on the dinner table of the rich. But there is the lobster, which went from being a lowly prisoner's food to the symbol of luxury. Hello everyone, welcome back to a brand new video on the channel. In this video, we are going to talk about lobster, which became an elite food after being served to prisoners and soldiers for years. What made the transition possible? Well, that's what we are going to discuss here. So, without any further ado, let's get started. The history of lobsters being consumed as food items goes way back. In the 17th century, lobsters were fed to prisoners across New England, and all we know is that prisoners hated it. There came a point when jailers had to restrict the amount of lobsters they were feeding to their prisoners because the inmates complained that serving lobster is a kind of punishment itself. How true that story is, we're not sure, but we definitely know that the fact that lobster was well known as a trash food during the 17th century, probably because it was consumed only by the desperate and needy people. Another reason why lobster was so despised back then is the fact that it had quite a bad reputation. You see, when a lobster dies, its body releases an enzyme that quickly circulates around its whole body and then quickly decomposes it. Now, it's the rule of nature that living organisms decompose after they die, right? However, the problem with lobster is that as soon as it dies, the process of decomposition begins, making it inedible. If you would eat a lobster that's been dead for only a few hours, you're gonna get sick. So, back in those days, when the sea waves would wash up lobsters onto the shore, if you were quick enough to pick up and cook them before they would rot, they would become a great source of protein for you. And protein is among the most important elements that humans need to consume. But good protein is only available in certain foods, and much of the food chain with a good amount of protein is out of range for poor people. But lobsters were a food item. They were cheap and filled with protein. Basically, the rotting characteristics plus the protein fulfillment thing made the lobsters a staple for the poor. They would get their nutritional requirements fulfilled on the cheap. And this tells us that despite the low standards associated with lobsters, they were mainly available and consumed by the poor. We humans are strange creatures. We have associated classes, even with food. For any food item that is consumed majorly by our fellow humans from the lower classes, a stigma is attached to it. If the stigma is there for a while, it turns into a taboo. And that's what happened to lobsters. When the rich of the time came to know that the poor were eating the lobsters, picking them up from washed-up shores, and the fact that it was being served to prisoners, they decided that lobsters were inferior and for the inferior class. It really surprises me how our world has been divided into different classes that we're forced to label food items as better or worse. However, back to the lobster going from trash to a delicate food item on the menu. So, while in New England and no one really liked the lobster because of its reputation, lobster was very easy to can once it was fully cooked. That turned the fate of this food item from being the most despised one, it became a decoration on the dinner tables of the rich. So, how did lobster transition from being called the cockroach of the sea to gaining a fine dining status? Let's get to it. In the 1860s, the process of canning food was on the rise. Food producers and suppliers came to know about the canning properties of food very recently, and the food items that would survive in a box of steel were still very limited. Surprisingly, lobster that rots within minutes after its death can survive for longer periods in a can once it's fully cooked. And that's where the story of lobster's rise to fine dining begins. You see, when the Civil War broke out, lobster became the protein source for soldiers. It was cheap, had a lot of protein content, and could last for days in the cans. Eventually, when the soldiers tried it, obviously they loved it because lobster was delicious. Due to the ongoing war and food shortage, the cans of lobster made it to the far-off areas in California. From there, the fate of this food item changed forever. The reason it was being served in the war was because it was easy to store in cans, but later its demand kept rising because it was cheap and high in protein. In the words of David Wallace, lobster was in demand only because it was cheap and high in protein. Basically, chewable fuel. Once the war was over, the world transitioned toward industrialization. Huge railway networks were built to transport people and goods. And when people, especially tourists who came to visit Europe, were served canned lobster, they fell in love with it. Obviously, tourists didn't know at the time that railways were serving them food items that everyone else would hate. For the tourist, what mattered was that lobster tasted great, and considering that it was canned, the curiosity of the travelers to enjoy a freshly cooked lobster rose. It is said that afterwards many tourists would just come to eat the lobster. Indeed, much of our world is just the perception that we've created of it. For those who didn't know the reputation, it didn't matter if the food was inferior or superior. They fall in love with the taste and wanted to have more of it. So the travelers who were served lobsters on the trains also demanded them in their cities. And by the start of the 20th century, many rich people fell in love with this delicious sea creature. Thanks to the millionaires like Diamond Jim Brady, who would eat 5 to 6 lobsters in one setting. That's quite a lot of lobsters, but if he loved the taste, so why not? However, once people were hooked on the taste of it, some wanted to take this dish back home. And obviously the railways didn't carry just ordinary people. There were many entrepreneurs among their travelers who saw the potential and the opportunity. So many new restaurants were opened, and those with already established reputations added the dish to their menus. This part answers your question of how it became popular among the rich. But the question still remains, how something that was once only consumed by the poor became so expensive, and to be honest, extravagant. Remember I said lobsters start rotting right after they die? So when the restaurants started serving the new dish to their customers, they had to ship the lobsters alive. I don't know what's this particular likeness of the elites towards complicated things. Now that it has to be shipped alive, the complications associated with it increased the price of lobster. So obviously only the big and fine dining restaurants were in the position to import lobsters and serve them to their customers. And that's just how the demand for lobsters in many cities around different countries kept rising, which came along with the increase in the price. The real value is indeed in the eye of the beholder. There was nothing wrong with the lobster before, and the taste was the same when the elites started to like it. But it's the fact that those who helped make this food item become popular in the world did not know about the taboo associated with it before they fell in love with the taste. Once everyone tasted it, it was a matter of time before the centuries-long stigma of lobsters being prisoners' food and then soldiers' food was gone. In under 50 years, lobsters transitioned from being a trashy food item to a delicacy of the elites. And that was the story of how lobsters ended up on the table of the rich. So, have you ever tried lobster? And do you like the taste of it? Share with us in the comments section below. On that note, I'll end this video here. I hope you liked it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.